This is the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Kendall of the notaballerina.com travel blog. Every episode, I'll share travel tales from several fellow travel lovers, and together we hope to entertain and inspire you, remind you of some of your own great travel experiences, and encourage you to hit the road again soon. So, Hannah, first of all, congratulations on your new memoir. And it must have been, I imagine, an absolute joy to write. Would I be right? It's like a love letter to your beloved Iceland.
You know, it was. I think looking back, I feel that the process was very much a joy, but I think it started out of what it says on the cover. I think it started from a place of deep homesickness. Um, I mean, I have many friends who have written memoirs, who do a lot of life writing. And I remember talking to them about it and sort of saying that I just could never see myself ever writing a memoir because I never felt that my life, I didn't think I'd done anything very interesting. This is what draws me to writing fiction is. I'm interested in other people and other times and all of that sort of thing. And then, of course, when COVID hit, much as I say in the book, I found myself isolated in very practical terms, like we all were, with the boundaries and the borders closed. But also I found myself in many ways kind of estranged from myself. And I think it was in that process of thinking, oh my gosh, like, who am I and what do I miss? And also knowing that even though I had no plans to go to Iceland, knowing that I couldn't even if I wanted to, I had this sort of huge emotional upswell of longing for this place, which coincided with a lot of dreams that I started happening. I'm not sure in which order they came, but that was when I thought, it is quite an extraordinary connection I have with this country. And the more time that elapses since that first year in 2003, when I went as an exchange student, the more I have come to understand that, not only did Iceland sort of set me on the path of my writing in very concrete terms and, especially in finding the subject material for my first book, but it shaped me as the kind of writer I would become. In fact, it pushed me towards writing in a way that I really don't think I would, I don't think I would have started writing with that kind of intent. As had I not gone to Iceland. And so, the memoir really came, in so many ways, obviously it is my story, but in many other ways, it's just because I wanted not being able to go there in person made me want to return there in my mind. And it was a joy. It was a joy being able to dig out all my old emails and videos and kind of see, oh my gosh, this has been a huge part of my life, even bigger than I think I had given it credit for. So that was a very joyful aspect of it.
Oh, I can imagine. Well, we both thoroughly enjoyed reading it, so I think that must show some joy in
it. Brought memories back for me, just for my trip. So,
oh, good.
So I think anyone who's been to Iceland probably brought something back.
Yeah.
Even just visualizing like the bus station in Reykjavik and places. For some reason, they just popped in my head. Oh, yeah, I remember that bus station. So, yeah.
This is the extraordinary thing. And, since this book came out last year, I've met with many people, many exchange students who've had a very similar experience of having the course of their life altered through this incredibly intense year in a foreign culture and in a foreign land, learning another language. But also, I think because Iceland is so small, I mean, geographically it's not large, but the population is so small too, that there is this very strong sense of a shared experience for anyone who has traveled there and seen these exact places. It's like a neighborhood that we all feel like we can belong to. And I think Icelanders themselves are very aware of this. They're a very tight-knit group of people. They're very in touch with their culture and history because there is that sense of we are not many, we have to band together. But I love it. I love it. Every time I went to a writers' festival, I got to speak with readers afterwards and people would tell me of the places they went and I know exactly what they're talking about and it's fantastic. It just makes me very jealous to return.
Yes, that's the thing.
Yeah.
I want to go back to the you just mentioned the being an exchange student, because when I read Burial Rites, I didn't know that was your background, and I didn't realize at the time that was where the Iceland thing began. And I know in your book you explain that you'd put down a few countries that were your preferences, and basically that they were all kind of snowy places, which I totally get. You know, I've grown up in Perth. We don't know what snow is, so and you kind of said, I think you hope the committee gets the gist. And they kind of got the gist, but on steroids, and sent you to Iceland. Yeah.
Yes. It was
a crazy turn
and
of
a small
events.
town in Iceland. No, we need a big town in Iceland.
Yeah, I mean, this was the extraordinary thing. I mean, Iceland is so, I mean, we've all been there. It's such a place which is so commonly frequented. It's it's on the bucket list of many people. But one thing that was interesting in returning to a lot of my diary entries from, over 20 years ago was thinking, oh yeah, Iceland really was not famous. This is before the Eyjafjallajökull, eruption. This is before, really Sigur were just getting famous then. This is before the financial crash, which also kind of consolidated it in the global sort of lens. And no one knew anything about it. And I remember trying to visualize this place, and the internet too being what it was. There was no information. I had no idea what Icelandic would sound like. And I remember being both terrifically excited by Iceland as a great unknown, and also, incredibly nervous too, because there was information and books on, say, Sweden or Canada. I could go to a library and I could find, a travel guide. There was nothing on Iceland. It really did feel like I was being sent to the very furthest kind of reaches of the globe.
Oh, I can imagine. I mean, back then, I remember when I was in high school, which is, I'm a little bit older than you, so it was, back a bit. But one of my friend's older sisters loved listening to the Sugar Cubes, and we would get driven everywhere listening to the Sugar Cubes. And so that was like all I knew about Iceland for the longest time. And Iceland, it doesn't even really sound like a real country, does it? It sounds like something you might invent. So
exactly, yeah, it does. It sounds like a made-up place, and certainly did back then, and particularly to someone, like Australians who have never seen snow. It's, there's no trees. It's dark in winter nearly all day. I mean, you can't even visualize what that is. We've all become, this next generation, my daughter, who is 8 years old, knows a lot more about other countries than I ever did. I think I was, just very parochial because I wasn't exposed to the sorts of things that she is. The internet, being what it is, but also I think just there's a greater cultural exchange, I think, through cultural content and stuff like that. But yeah, it was, the Sugar Cubes is a really cool way to get to know Iceland, though. That's very cool. I wasn't cool enough to know the Sugar Cubes before I went.
Well, I wasn't really cool either, but my bestie's sister,
I still don't know who
went
the
on to
Sugar
become
Cubes
a famous artist, was pretty cool. So she was my the way I got
that
to
is
be
very
a little bit cool.
You can ride on her coattails.
Yeah. Sometimes you have to. I'm not good at being cool. Justin, you mentioned something about the exchange student and the school part in our notes.
Yeah. It's quite an interesting thing because I grew up in Canberra, and we a little bit different from the rest of Australia. But then you described how the school system in Iceland worked, and funnily enough, I don't know whether the education department in Canberra looked at Scandinavia or Iceland to get ideas, but funnily enough, there were so many similarities for me. And yet, if I talk to someone outside of Canberra, they go, "No, it doesn't happen here." And just things like calling teachers by first names, not having to go to class unless you've got a class on. You kind of treat it as if you're a young adult. If you don't come to class, it's you're an adult or learning to become an adult. And even just things like, the teachers like the section you talk about how you were writing poetry, I think in Icelandic class, and expected to get in trouble for that. And the teacher was like, no, they wanted to find your passions and help you learn. And there was very much my experience in Canberra. I don't know if it's still like that, but the world's changed a lot since then. But I just found it very interesting. And I'm guessing you probably felt like you might have thrived in that environment a bit more compared to, say, back in Australia. I'm interested in how you feel on that.
Gosh, that's so interesting to hear that you had a similar experience, because in my mind it feels quite I mean, I think things have probably changed. And, I know, for example, we've all learned a lot from the Finnish school system, for example, see Salberg and all the wonderful things he has come to, here to say and to teach us about. But certainly that wasn't my experience of high school. I had a very positive experience of high school. I had very many wonderful teachers, but one thing I think I found, which it seems like you're speaking to as well, was that everything felt very egalitarian within the schooling system, the sort of the upper high school. There was it was mostly for sort of like a senior school. There were some people there in their early 20s, and it was kind of like a university. That independence was encouraged. You had responsibility of getting yourself to school on time, of showing up to classes, of doing the work, of taking that kind of initiative. And I think even if I had been a far more confident person and much better equipped to adapt to the whole exchange experience, even attending a school like that, I think would have encouraged me to grow in those areas. As it was, having the exchange experience and then also attending a high school where suddenly it felt very much like I was at university, where I could see that the teachers, there was no interest, there was no sort of sense that I would be particularly looked after by them, but also in the same sense, there wasn't kind of the threat of punishment or of having to toe a line. I remember on one of my first days walking around the back of the school and there was all this snow and people were sort of under the eaves of the high school, in this ditch that had been dug away of all this snow. And the teachers and all the students are just there having a cigarette together around the back. I mean, that's bananas coming from my high school.
I saw that in my school experience too. Even though
in Canberra, really.
This is the thing. Nobody believes me except for people who went to school in Canberra in the my high school, late 80s, early 90s. So yeah.
Yeah, it was great. I mean, people my age seemed a lot more grown up in many ways.
Yeah.
That was certainly one of the things I noticed. And I was a young year 12 as it was, and I think I was also quite socially young in my growing up. But it was actually a really lovely feeling to think, oh no, actually I don't know, in some ways it kind of restored my understanding of agency in terms of education, the sense that, okay, no, I'm responsible. I am grown up enough. I have that kind of trust placed in me. I can choose the subjects I want and I can arrange my life how I want. Rather than, okay, I'm just going to wait to do what I'm told.
Yeah. The other part that I really loved about your exchange experience was the Icelandic family. The Icelandic family that you made, essentially. So Peter and Regina, I'm not sure of the pronunciation, but tell us a little bit more about the connection that you built there.
Oh, Peter and Regina, I miss them so much. I last saw them in that final instance, which is in the memoir, when I went over to Reykjavik for the writing conference. So I am well overdue to catch up with them. But we text and we email. So Pieter was one of the youngest members of the Rotary Club. So I was a Rotary Exchange student. And as part of the Rotary Exchange program, you were assigned essentially a counsellor, who is just someone who is kind of there to check in, kind of do a welfare check now and then. And I remember being drawn to Pieter because he had this kind of, I don't know, this very out of place American accent because he'd studied in Florida. He was a photographer, but like many Icelanders I know, he also had about 3 other careers going. So he was the town photographer, but he was also the sort of the IT guy around town, and he did all the IT for the school. So I would see him a lot at the high school, and he would sort of, ask me how I was. And I knew that he had 4 young children. He had 4 kids, 10 and under. He was always busy, but he was. And he still is, I think, someone who is very people-oriented. I think he has a huge heart for people. And as much as every time he said, how you going? You're all right at home at the host family. I was the first host family I was with where I was quite lonely. And I'd say, oh, yeah, it's fine. It's fine. Everything's going well. I'm fine. He knew that I was very homesick and that I was struggling. I think it bears saying, when I arrived, and people who have read the book will know this, but I had a pretty difficult first couple of months in Iceland. It was very dark. It was very cold, and I was alone a great deal, not only isolated in my lack of understanding of the language and the culture, but even within the home I was placed, I was often there in solitude. And I really struggled with that, as well as the compounding effects of the weather. And I think Pieter suspected as much. and I never knew this, but I never knew that this is how it happened, but I don't think it's a spoiler to say that I ended up going and living with his family. That, all right, you're ready to move to your next family now. I knew I would have at least 2 families. And you're going to come live with me and Regina, my wife, who I had met previously and who was lovely, and all their kids. And I went from this very quiet home where no one spoke and no one ever seemed to be together to this house which was filled with, like the 4-year-old, like 3-year-old begging for ice cream out my window every morning and coming in, and they would just go through my stuff and chatter nonstop to me in Icelandic. And so my language skills just soared, because there's nothing like talking with a 3-year-old and a 6-year-old and a 10-year-old to kind of get that basic vocabulary under your belt. And I loved it. I loved the chaos. I think I probably, under different circumstances, might have found the lack of privacy and the lack of sort of this being a big sister kind of a burden. But I was so ready for that kind of company. I was so ready to be embraced by a family. And then fast forward years later, I never knew this. Pieter told me that he was never supposed to be my host family. had another family, which I did end up going with, but you could see how lonely I was. And he basically intervened on my behalf and said, no, she's coming with me. He basically claimed me. And I have many wonderful friends in Iceland now, but Pieter and Regina, they're my mum and dad. That's what I call them. And they call me daughter. And yeah, I feel incredibly fortunate that I got to meet them and have that kind of relationship with them. They're reading the book at the moment, actually. I'm very nervous about it.
Oh, they will love it, because I feel like I love them from reading it, so I'm sure that they will enjoy that experience.
Yeah, they're beautiful people.
Yeah. Oh, how fortunate. It's funny, the small choices that can turn out to be big things, the fact that you got to Iceland in the first place, and that, if they hadn't done that, you might not have had the same experience of being able to really assimilate so well. And
yeah, I think that was another thing which led me to write this book, was because we all go through life and occasionally we'll experience these feelings of great fortune, this sense that we were at the right place at the right time, or this sense of synchronicity or meaningful coincidence. And I think I've always felt that. I've always felt there is meaning in coincidence in my life. And I think I always anticipated, though, that as the time goes past, I'd be like, oh, that just happened. That was nothing in it. But the opposite has been true. And when I looked back and I saw all these things that led me to Iceland, and then all of my various experiences there, which seemed meaningful at the time, they've only grown in meaning and grown in significance as I've become older. And certainly my relationship with Pieter and Regina, so much of it has felt fated. And I recognize too that it's very easy to assign fate from a position of having arrived there. But there is a lot of what led me to write this book was, there are some really strange things which have happened, and some really, I don't know, a great feeling of alignment. And I think I wanted to write it down in some ways just to prove to myself that, yeah, these things happened, and there is a kind of narrative there now.
I mean, and the same with burial rites, what we read in your memoir about the small coincidences along the way of the people you met who knew more of the story, or, I mean, that's, like all of those things, I feel there's a fate involved as well.
Yeah, it's funny because even within Icelandic culture, certainly as I knew it during that exchange year, the idea of fate, is very strong within Norse and Nordic history. I mean, we see it all in the sagas, the idea of people having a fate. Also making decisions and wanting this kind of independence. Independence is so huge, but also at the same time of things being kind of unavoidable, that that things have already been set in place. And that I felt that acutely when I was researching the Book of Burial Rites, to the point where I felt like I was going a bit mad with it, honestly. So I started writing it down just to think, like, this isn't just in my head, right? If I put it on paper, and I'm so glad I did, because I was able to return to those kinds of journal entries when writing about what it was like to research the story of the last woman executed in Iceland and turn her story into a book.
Yeah. Yes. It's great to have those records to return to. We might return to some of that later, but we wanted to also talk a little bit about the fact that you managed to learn Icelandic. So
Oh, look,
Justin
those
has a
kids,
question
I didn't have a
first.
choice.
I know, but
I
how
wanted them.
fabulous.
Yeah, it was great. In fact, I'll always remember the sentence, "She understood me," because I remember they'd always have friends over and they were chattering away. And all the kids, even though they knew I didn't speak a lot of Icelandic, would still talk to me. And I remember one was like asking, like, "Where's the VHS tape?" or something. And I was like, "Oh, it's over here." And this kid, it wasn't one of the family members, turned around and sort of announced to everyone, "She understood me. Hun skilde me." And I remember, I would never forget that line from that point. I was so gratified. But yeah, I mean, Icelandic is such a beautiful language, and I'm very glad that I learned it when I was there, because I think it did give me greater access to Icelandic culture, and it gave me a greater understanding and awareness of all the things that language holds, right? Language isn't just words. It's not just simply communicating. I mean, from language, we carry our stories in language and in the words we choose and the proverbs and the metaphors and you know, the nicknames even. And so the more of that I could sort of understand and appreciate, the closer I felt I could come to the heart of what it meant to be Icelandic. But of course, Icelandic is also a deeply, I mean, if you want to look at it in black and white, a deeply impractical language to learn when you're Australian. I've met one person on the street speaking Icelandic and I scared her. I remember this was at university shortly after I came home and I was lining up at an ATM to get some money out. And there was a woman on her phone in front of me getting money out. And I realized I could understand her. And I was like, oh my gosh, she's Icelandic. So she's putting her money in her wallet and she walks up the street. I chased after her, which on retrospect, not a great idea to chase after someone who's just withdrawn like $200 from an ATM. And she finally turned around, like, what do you want? And I was like, you're Icelandic in Icelandic. She's like, yeah. And I was like, cool. And then just dissolved in mortification. But yeah, that's been the only instance where I've encountered someone. I have met other Icelanders who have passed through, but here now. But yeah, it's
not a great call for Icelandic on the streets.
Not a
of
great
Australia.
call for it. I mean, I'm so glad I still have it, but I'd become very rusty just through. There's so few opportunities to practice and to keep it alive. In a way that perhaps wouldn't necessarily be, if I could join, Alliance Française or something. And
true.
So I am very rusty. And it does take a few weeks now for my brain to kind of switch SD cards. But yeah, it's a marvelous language. It's deeply complicated, but it's I think even learning it gave me a new appreciation of language and words and the things you can do. I mean, it's a trip to learn about compound words and that you can make them up and invent your own meanings. You feel like Shakespeare, it's great.
That's a good point. Yeah. Justin, your point there leads into the.
Oh yeah, it's interesting because I definitely can relate. You did make a comment about, I think it was when you went back and you sort of said my grammar and syntax are atrocious, but it's a relief to know the vocabulary is still there.
Yeah.
And the only language I profess that I could actually speak in is other than English is Spanish. And I once had a guy in a bar tell me, "Where did you learn to speak Spanish?" And I kind of said, "Oh, I learned in back home in Australia. I did some language classes in South America and places like that." And he said, "Your vocabulary is amazing, but your grammar is awful. That of a 5-year-old, something like that." And I yeah, I'm going to Spain next month,
this
and
is like the vocab is the most important part, mostly, isn't it?
I mean,
well, I did find a Costa Rican I stayed at a house in it was over on the east side in Iceland. I forget the name of the town.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't be able to pronounce it even if I did know it.
And so you use Spanish
Costa Rican, yeah, I use Spanish. There's a Costa Rican lady who was married to an Icelandic man, and
there you go.
I would talk to her in Spanish.
In Spanish.
I love that. Yeah,
and she was so proud. They had their own garden. They grew potatoes and tomatoes, and they cooked up this delicious meal. It was great.
All the vocab you knew.
Amazing.
Yeah, I need to know Icelandic, and but yeah, Just
Well, I
pronouncing it.
noted, Hannah, you talked about the noun inflection in one of the chapters. So I lived in
Mhm.
Slovakia for a year and I tried to learn Slovak. I was teaching English and we all got free Slovak lessons and I was like, yay. I think there was about 20 of us in the first class and every week they dropped off and I got down to the last 3 or 4 people, but then I gave up too. But they also have the noun inflection thing. Like you had
It
the
makes it very
example
tricky.
of
Yeah.
horse.
Yeah.
Can you tell me? I can't even pronounce them right.
Do you know what? Because I can't remember. I'm going to have to find it.
Page 85.
Page
You've got
85.
the
Okay.
hardback in front of you.
All right. Do you want me to read it for you?
Yes, please. That would be
Okay.
fabulous. We'll
Anyone who
have
hasn't
all
read
different
this
words
bit.
for horse.
All right. Before I arrived in Iceland, I thought that learning a language would essentially involve memorizing a vocabulary list. Find out the Icelandic word for horse and say that instead. It has been dispiriting to learn that language, particularly Icelandic, is so much more complex, that it demands so much more of me. Icelandic is a dialect of Old Norse, a tongue once common across Scandinavia, and I have learned that Iceland's geographical isolation peat-bogged the language from the 12th century on, while elsewhere it evolved into Swedish, Danish, and Norwegian. This means that it has, devastatingly, retained a lot of its 12th century inflections, highly irregular conjugation patterns, and full-body embrace of compound words. When I ask Thorir about how the word for horse, hestur, might be inflected, he tells me it might be hest, hestin, hestar, hesta, hesti, hestum, hestinum, hests, hestatnir, hestinum, hestana, hestanna, or hestsins, depending on the context.
Oh, it's just.
Oh, yeah, it's hard.
It's so hard. I mean, my approach, I speak German semi-fluently, and my approach with German is what I would do if I was trying to learn this in Icelandic is just to say the first syllable and then try and swallow the rest. Like with the German articles, der, die, das, die, den, dem, I can never remember the genders and I just don't even care that much. So I just use de and make it kind of swallow the rest of it. And, I get away with it a fair bit.
It's true. I think that's it, though. I think that's the secret. I mean, I feel like Icelanders, because there are so few Icelanders, and Icelandic is not, commonly spoken by foreigners, even now that they've had, obviously a huge tourist trade, but also many, foreign-born nationals coming in to, administer to that tourist trade, because there's just not enough Icelanders to kind of, work in all the hotels and do things like that. Because English is kind of encroaching, I think, on that public space in terms of Icelandic. When you do speak Icelandic, I think I have a lot of friends who tell me I speak with fluency, and I don't. I know I don't. I know I sound nothing like an Icelander. I don't think I'm fluent at all, but they tell me I am because I think comparatively I'm doing okay. And you try it, right? I think if you're willing to try and make, a frequent and public fool of yourself in your various pronunciation and in your grammatical slip-ups as well. I mean, Icelanders give me and did, give me a lot of grace. But that's also how you learn, because then often what people do in a quite a natural way is repeat what you were trying to say, but correct it. And for me, that's the only way I can learn language. I have to hear it and I have to remember that kind of wider context. I'm not going to be able to, pick up a bunch of Icelandic grammar books here and suddenly get it right. I need, my dear friends like Hedda and Donnie to be like, huh? Oh, okay, yeah, I know what you were saying. This is what you would say. I'm like, oh yeah, of course. That's what I was going to say.
Yeah, I knew that.
I knew that for sure.
Hannah, I love you. To make a frequent and public fool of yourself, that is absolutely the only way to learn a language, isn't it? That's such a good way to put it. Yeah.
I need to try. It just comes naturally overseas sometimes.
You've got to do it. I'm learning Norwegian at the moment because I feel like Iceland's given me a little leg up, so I recognize a lot of the vocabulary. The grammar is a lot easier, but I've started trying to speak it where possible. And my GP speaks Norwegian, so sometimes when I go see her, I'll speak Norwegian. And again, I get that classic kind of like, oh, and then she catches on and, but I'm like, no, I've got to make myself uncomfortable. Otherwise I'm never going to learn it. I'm going to be able to maybe read a newspaper, but I'm not going to be able to have conversation. So yeah, it's the only way. You've just got to, give up the ego.
I love that you've gone from the quite impractical Icelandic to the slightly less impractical Norwegian.
Yeah. I'll just nail all the little, infrequently used languages, or not even that, just the countries where English is very widely spoken and probably
Yeah.
spoken better than me, They have a much better understanding of English grammar than I ever do.
I did get the impression I was in Iceland in 2016 that English was by that stage quite popular.
Yeah.
Like it was almost like Iceland was going to become a dual, like two languages, English and
Mm.
Icelandic. But I think it was also important that they hold on to their language because we only have to look around Australia with the indigenous languages that are disappearing and stuff like that, how important it is to try and hold on to it. And I don't think that's ever going to happen in Iceland. I think it's good, but I think they probably I got the sense from people saying that they understand how impractical this little island of about 300,000 people speaking their own language is. So I don't think they're too what's the word? They're too proud to not try to learn other languages. But as your experience has been, they absolutely really adore others learning Icelandic, and appreciate it. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's an extraordinary language because it's unchanged, right? It gives us a glimpse in many ways to sort of, early Norse and things like that. But I think also, Icelanders have always had this awareness. I don't think it's been since the tourist boom. I think it's become a little more urgent. But I mean, having the naming committee in place and, when like the television and radio became kind of ubiquitous, certainly across kind of what we would call maybe the Western world, Icelanders were like, we're not calling this TV, we're calling this sjónvarpið. We're coming up continually with new Icelandic words. We're kind of really holding to the language in that kind of way, really preserving it, kind of actively preserving it, even as we sort of come into the modern age. And I'm really glad they do that. It's such an interesting argument. And I do find that every time I speak to my Icelandic friends or, I read an article about language, either written by, Icelanders or foreigners now working in Iceland, living in Iceland, of which, some of even my university friends are now living there. It's so interesting to kind of consider the various perspectives because there is a very real risk that younger generations will grow up, maybe preferencing English because it's more convenient, but at the same time, people do it, like you say, have such pride in Icelandic, and it is very important. It's very much tied into, I think, still the Icelandic identity. I'm also can't really speak to, in many ways, to present day Iceland. I mean, so much of this book is 20 years ago. And I mean, I was in a little town where, lots of people spoke English, but lots of people also didn't. There were people I was unable to be friends with until the second half of my exchange when I could sort of attempt conversation with them. I don't think you would find that these days, Instead, what you do have is a situation where people say, for example, this happened to some of the older people, particularly from the countryside, who might not be as fluent in English, want to go out to a restaurant. They call up the restaurant. They answer in English. The menu is in English because of the huge tourists who come through and would, need that in English. And so they find themselves unable to make a booking in Icelandic. So, I mean, these are really interesting kind of arguments and questions. And it's, I don't think there's, it's not black and white in any way, but it does raise, really interesting ideas about the value of language and its worth outside of communication.
Yeah, I really admire the way the Icelanders do really actively hold on to their language. I always remember about 20 years ago, I lived in Japan. One of my good friends was a dental hygienist and she was Japanese. And she would often tell me, we played the English game today. And that would mean that for the whole day, they would try to not use any borrowed English words in their Japanese speech. And it was actually really hard to do because Japanese has borrowed so many words that are used in everyday life. And this is even 20 years ago, that it was actually hard for them. Sometimes, especially the younger ones, couldn't remember the proper Japanese words for things like beer and stuff and all sorts of basic things. So and like I don't want English to dominate everywhere. I want there to be this amazing, mix of languages because, as you say, they hold so much culture and so much history and value.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know, maybe this is kind of an old-fashioned thing or because I just like the idea of it, but I love the idea that travel should push you out of your comfort zone in regards to language. I think that wherever you go, you should learn a little bit of the language because it's, in some ways, I feel like it's just a gesture of gratitude and a kind of a gesture that you are aware of that you are coming into this place, that you're not imposing your language on anyone else. And I don't think people go in and start speaking English because they're actively thinking, I'm imposing my culture on other people. But I think it's about just expressing an awareness. And yeah, there's something which is, I don't know, I feel like those moments also really lead to kind of fantastic memories too when you're trying to converse with someone in another language and you're hardly understanding each other. But yeah, there's something very human, and yeah, I've had many of those experiences, and I think of them very fondly, and I would feel sad that people are missing out on that, you know.
Yeah.
I think you'd have many podcast episodes, man, based on stories about people learning the local language and opening doors. So
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
it'd be a very
Totally.
common theme. Just
And those tricky conversations, which are barely conversations, but you
Vision.
manage to
Yeah.
make yourselves understood with each other, which is
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
so much richer than, oh, here's my translation app and now we
Mm.
can talk to each other just using software. It's just not the same, is
No,
it?
it's not. And it's also a lot less funny. I was just having
Yes.
a chat with my friend the other day who's living in France, and she just made a tremendous error at the post office where she thought she was asking for a stamp and she was asking for something a lot more inappropriate. And I won't embarrass her publicly and say what it was, but needless to say, the postmaster was very confused. And I was telling her stories about the time where, the word for chewing gum and the word for a hair tie in Icelandic are very similar. And I would always mix them up and I'd be like, yeah, no worries, just going to spit out this hair tie, and like just people are just like, what are you talking about? They're just, I don't know. It just adds to the experience, adds to the colour.
Yes, mine was always the words for humidity or humid and to be gay are very similar in German. And one has an umlaut, the two dots, and one doesn't. And I could never remember which one's which. And, whichever you're talking about, it sounds unusual if you use the wrong one. But
I love
so
that.
many times I got it wrong. So.
I love it. I'm looking that up afterwards. I'm going to try and work both words into a sentence in German. See how it goes.
Yes. That's a good challenge. Yeah, absolutely. Now, before we go on to our other questions, I've just got a couple of questions in the group. Oh, no, one question in the group. Sandy asks, question for Hannah, if there is time. If there was to be a movie of Always Home, Always Homesick, who would you like to play Hannah?
Oh my gosh, that's crazy. I have no idea, honestly.
I also couldn't answer this question.
That's an impossible question. It really is. I mean, I'm in a very I'm adapting two of my novels for screen at the moment. So I've written a screenplay for The Good People, which was my second book, and also Devotion, which is my third novel. And it's always an interesting moment when maybe the producers or the director say, did you have any thoughts on casting? I mean, I know I don't have any contribution. They're just making chit chat. And I think, no, I could never really. I never think of an actor and sort of a character as kind of something much more nebulous for me. And so I fear that if I were to answer that question, and thank you for that question, I would either come across as having just kind of, I don't know, a very inflated sense of myself. Jennifer Lawrence, that'd be great. Yeah. No, I don't know. I would just trust in the vision of the director. I could never.
Oh, it'd have to be someone quite young anyway, so probably someone unknown.
That's
Yes.
true.
Quite
Back to
young when
your
you went.
yes. It's most
So
would be set
you
back
couldn't
to
possibly
your
know
young
anyone that
person.
would be. Yeah. It'd be
Yeah, and it's a
Sandy,
very.
I'm asking back if Sandy's still watching. Why don't you tell us who we think?
Yeah, do tell me. And then if it ever, I don't think it will happen, but if it does, I'll have some ideas. I think it's also a very elegant response. And sort of, it's kind of, you seem quite cool and disinterested. You're like, oh, just an unknown, just someone who's just very talented. Let's give him a great break,
Yes, that's right. Their great break was playing Hannah Kent.
Yeah.
Exactly.
They have to learn how to speak Icelandic, though, or speak Icelandic. So
Yeah. Actually, they could probably get an Icelander because when I was at school, I did meet quite a few people with Australian accents who learnt English through watching Neighbours. So it was an interesting surprise.
I'm sure there's probably kids in Iceland learning Bluey now.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure.
Absolutely true. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I reckon you're right.
Yeah. Now, our probably be our last topic, but I'm interested in this part too. And we've got we titled in our notes, Believing Beyond What Can Be Proven. But a few things we wanted to ask you more about. For me, it was the hidden people, which I think you talked about you had a chat with the writer Alda Sigmundsdottir about the hidden folk. And I liked her suggestion that that they're created, or they're there to help people deal with difficult things, which is an explanation I'd never heard before about that. But I love that. But we often hear this stereotype or idea that Icelanders believe in a lot of things that perhaps the rest of us don't believe in. So tell us more.
Yeah, I mean, this was true when I went as well. So 20 years ago, I think there is this very popular belief, or people like to think of Icelanders as, they believe in elves. And I feel like this was really kind of, not that she said anything, but I feel like people way back when, Björk was becoming sort of a global phenomenon, and she seemed very eccentric or quirky or whatever sort of, attribute, whatever, however they would describe her. In that language of that day and that time, I think they were it seemed to kind of fit. It was this narrative, right, that people were kind of creating not Icelanders weren't creating it. They were creating it on behalf of Icelanders. And, we've said before, Iceland does seem kind of like a fantastical country, even the name. It kind of feels neat, right? And exotic. My experience, if we want to talk about, say, the supernatural or the things which aren't easily explained. When I was in Iceland, I heard very few elf stories. I heard a few. The ones I did hear were predominantly when I was being driven around the countryside, and the road would deviate to go around some rocks. And there's quite a few stories of this kind, where there are, there are people trying to make a road or a tunnel or do something to the landscape, alter it predominantly for transport, and the machinery would break down or someone would get sick, and there would be kind of an interceding figure, often a local, who would come in and say, you can't do that. It's because this is where the elves have their school, as one example I was told. And then they would maybe find out a way that they could reach a compromise with someone kind of being this intermediary. And then they would continue and the machine would start working again and they would go around. And this is something that I even though I heard those stories, they were often told to me not kind of in the campfire, gather around, I'm going to tell you some weird stuff. They were dropped in the same way that other stories of the area were always sort of given to me. They just seemed to be of the place and of the landscape. And but I was also not told them until I had a relationship with those sorts of people. So there was a sense too of trust. And there were some stories, and I heard of some people who were said to be able to see the elves, and most of them didn't want to talk about it. And they did very little, even to their friends and family. So it kind of was completely at odds with this idea of, Icelanders creeping around, seeing elves everywhere. And I think there are
to like our Indigenous stories and sacred places.
Totally.
That kind of,
Totally. Yeah. And, it was interesting. When I was writing The Good People, I did a lot of research about, fairy culture and the sort of, and folkloric culture in Ireland, in rural Ireland, and very, very similar, the sense that it's just one and the same. It's actually a story of land. It's a story of weather. It's a story of kind of being in places and doing things where you shouldn't be or you shouldn't be doing. And I mean, I don't really care if they're not true or if it's not elves, because I think they speak to something, they still are true stories. They're still speaking to kind of natural boundaries, or they're speaking to sort of dominance and kind of, doing things you ought not to do, not keeping things in balance. And it was really interesting to speak to Alda about the Huldafolk, who are the sort of the hidden people of Iceland. And I never really heard the word elves. It was always the Huldafolk when I heard them. This hidden people, or the people who live in what we think of as hills. Again, very similar to sort of the Irish stories. And Alda's explanation, or her reasoning, is that people would come up with, if people went missing, this was a way that they could console themselves, in the way that many folk stories do, or folk explanations of behaviors, or why plants are the way they are, or why, an example I always think of is in Ireland, people could be taken by the fairies, and you were at particular risk at certain sort of times in your life. And a group of people who were very vulnerable to fairy interference were women who had just given birth. And I mean, knowing what we do now about postnatal depression and postnatal anxiety and all these sorts of things, these sort of changes that can come upon a person after having a child, would kind of, without having that kind of explanation, communities would accommodate them by having these stories to sort of shift blame away from the person going through that experience or exhibiting that kind of behavior and attribute it to a supernatural force, which was in essence, unpredictable, and sometimes, could inflict great damage or malevolence, but also in the same time could be, a source of great generosity. So you never really knew where you sat with them. It was a way of kind of finding a way to accommodate uncertainty, right?
Yeah.
And also, sadness and a lack of closure. And I think she's really onto something when she speaks of all these Huldafolk stories in Iceland of people who got lost in the fog that does come down very swiftly on mountains sometimes, the weather that changes incredibly fast and they were never seen again. How much better to think of them being taken in and looked after by the Huldafolk rather than perishing through exposure.
Yeah, absolutely.
It makes sense. But at the same time, I heard so many stories where there isn't an easy explanation like that at all. People reappearing after a year of being absent. I don't know. I like the not knowing of it. I don't have to know. I'm happy to sit with the mystery in the middle of all of these stories. I think that's a big part of it.
I mean, that also makes a lot of sense for a place like Iceland. It feels like a more mysterious, harder to grasp place in many ways. Justin, you might want to reference what you had.
Yeah, and I mean, I was just thinking to what Hannah was just saying as well. Like, I'm not really. It's hard for me to. I'm not one of those people that believe in a lot of all this stuff and that, but just little things like, I mean, the wood in the skull and things like that. It all and finding that skull from that medium, I think she was, and just stuff like that. I mean, it's hard to not. And then I was just thinking, even last year, there's places that just have an aura about them. So, and I know in the book, I think you mentioned that you were standing on a headland or something like that, and you just felt something. And I was just thinking, like, Uluru is another place. You go to Uluru in Australia, and there's just something there that you just can't explain. There's a feeling you can't explain, but you just kind of feel these things. And I don't know. Like I said, I'm the most unbeliever of things in the world. I need absolute proof, but there's obviously something there for these beliefs or these things to be a common recurring theme across different cultures and
yeah absolutely. I mean, this is the thing. I feel like sometimes we can get very caught up in needing to prove it. I'll only believe it if I prove it, without recognizing that these stories often serve other functions, even if it's to kind of just create a more, make us more comfortable with this kind of discomfort, even, if you know what I mean. But I mean, I grew up with, and I mention it in the memoir, with several people I knew who would tell me these stories of their experiences. And to this day, I absolutely believe that was what they experienced, isn't what necessarily I believe. I'm very happy not knowing. Even the extraordinary coincidences that I experienced in researching Agnes Magnusdottir, it could absolutely be something which is uncanny. I'm very open to that. But I'm also very open to the possibility that I started dreaming these intense dreams, or I ran into these people because I was preoccupied and my subconscious was processing it, or because Iceland is naturally a very small place and it was inevitable that I run into something which would feel, fortuitous to the extent that it was supernatural. I mean, I'm happy with both. And also, I kind of think it's not my business to prove it, I can kind of just sit with it and be grateful that I had that experience. But I absolutely know where you come from. And I've had to fight that instinct to kind of drill down and get to the bottom of it. But I mean, you can't. There's so many things which we can't. And I do take I think there's a lot of wisdom and just kind of, sometimes thinking, well, not for me to know. This, if anything, it just gives me a greater appreciation of the bigger mystery. Who am I to have to know every single thing, have to understand everything? But I mean, that's impossible. There's beauty in that mystery, I think.
There is, yeah. Yeah, you're absolutely right. So true. Yeah, sometimes we get caught up in the trying to prove things, and yet there's things that have been proven centuries after they've become, like common knowledge, common wisdom, and nobody's actually proven them. And eventually they might be proven. But as you say, it doesn't matter either way, does it? For lots of things, it's like part of the mystery and the fun, isn't it?
Exactly. I mean, I was telling my kids the other day about foxglove, right? Again, to kind of draw on that, from the Irish folklore, it was the great, it was the fairies' herb. It was kind of the great herb because sometimes it would kill you because it contains digitalis, which is toxic if you don't have a heart condition. But if you did have a heart condition, perhaps unbeknownst to yourself, it could save your life. We still use digitalis in heart medication. So, but for people who don't understand the inner workings, you're like, well, this could either kill you or it's going to save you. And who is as capricious as that? It must be from the fairies, But it still gives you guidelines in terms of how to use it or to be wary or to not take it unnecessarily. So there still is a lot of truth and wisdom in it. And it's only later under modern science that we're just like, okay, yeah, this is a compound that does exactly this in the body. And I think there's so much wisdom and knowledge contained in folklore and contained in indigenous stories that we later have to discover, by which I mean, Western white people.
Yes.
Have to discover it at a later date and claim. But I mean, people already know, it's just been communicated in a different way. So yeah.
So true. Fabulous. Well, I know I would actually like to speak to you for hours more about
although I do have one more question.
Yes, go on.
Yeah, because I want to know, in the book, Peter and asked when you're going to bring your wife and your kids over to Iceland, and you had said you hadn't thought about it very much. And I thought, that's kind of unusual, but I'm now curious, have you even thought about it at all? Or is it, I'm assuming it's something you really do want to do. You just, obviously life is, and you want your kids to be at an age to appreciate these things, but yeah.
I would love to. Yeah, in answer to your question, I would love to. Actually, my kids are obsessed with Iceland, and I don't talk about it all the time. I mean, I'll make them some food, and occasionally I'll tell them stories, but I haven't, raised them speaking Icelandic to them. But they both love the country, and they're deeply fascinated by it. And more than anything, they want to see snow, and that does come up all the time. So I would love to be able to go to Iceland and to spend another year living there, but it's very expensive. So I think I think that's probably the greatest kind of prohibitive factor at the moment.
Pretty much the opposite side of the world from Australia. So.
Yeah. And to live, there's a lot of arrangements. And, I'm very, very lucky. I'm very grateful that my books are published, but I'm still a writer at the end of the day.
You're not a billionaire, is what
I'm not a billionaire. Yeah, is what I'm saying. So, we're hoping to, but I think it probably wouldn't be for a few more years anyway, until my youngest is still 5. So we might let him grow up a little bit more, and so he can remember it, too.
Yeah.
But I would love that. I mean, what an incredible way to pass that experience on to them.
Yeah. I love that they love it already. So
it's so cute. Yeah, they really enjoy it. It's lovely. I honestly, it probably has started with me making them Icelandic pancakes all the time. They've got some very positive associations with the place, but
food does it, doesn't it? Okay, what is an Icelandic pancake exactly? Like, why?
Oh, well, it was one of the best things I ended up bringing back with me on my exchange was this pönnukökupanna, the pancake pan. So an Icelandic pancake, it's a great word. It's one of my favorites. It's like a thick skillet with a tiny rim on it. And the whole idea with Icelandic pancakes is that because there wasn't a lot of flour, I think this is kind of where it came from, is they're very thin. So the idea is that if you were a good Icelandic housewife back in the day, this might even be from a Halldór Laxness novel or something, you should be able to put one against a newspaper and read the newspaper through the pancake. That's how thin they should be. So they're essentially a crepe. They're very kind of
very thin crepe.
Yeah. And you can put the sugar on them and roll them up and eat them cold with, your cafe a bit later, kind of as like a Swedish fika sort of thing. Yeah.
Oh, fabulous. Oh, well, on that tasty note, I guess we have to wind up. But thank you so much, Hannah. It was such a joy to read the book. In fact, I listened to the audiobook first, and to hear your beautiful Icelandic pronunciation. My friend and I walked around saying, excuse my butchering, but Sordkrukka, because we just loved it.
Yeah,
well, that's from copying you. And this is my friend Catherine Justin knows her, who she's a travel writer, ended up on a cruise to Iceland, and she messaged me one day. She said, "We've just docked at Soda Cracker."
No way! Really? That's so cool.
Fabulous. Yeah.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, that's fantastic.
So we've all had a lot of joy out of this book, and such a pleasure to meet and chat with you tonight as well.
It's been amazing. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a lot of fun. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. This has been another episode of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. Show notes and other information are at notaballerina.com/podcast. Join me again soon for another chat about why we travel. Bye for now.